you very much. Perfect. David, can I have the clicker?
This clicker will not help you.
No problem at all. I'll just say.
It should be on the podium. Unless somebody stole it.
Yeah.
Somebody stole it.
Ooh, this is a good start. Stop the timer.
We'll figure it out.
That's fine. I can just say next slide if it's a worst case scenario. Let's see, perfect.
And he's going to do some wisdom.
Yes, it does work.
Back.
It works. We can start the show. Hello. So hello, everyone. It's been a pleasure to listen to all these amazing talks over the last 2 days. And there's so much commonality in terms of what we've talked about so far. Today's really going to be focusing on some of the work that I've done with an organization called Climate Labs. We were able to help a non-profit called Power to Change. They support underrepresented communities and businesses access funding so they can improve their lives and their communities around them. So put this in mind. Imagine if you're a community warehouse or community space. How can you make sure that that environment is more sustainable over time? How can you ensure that if you're a small business, for example, you want to use green energy or create a more efficient way of improving your environment? These are some of the key things we really focus on. And this focus on the aspect of reducing CO2, ensuring that we promoted social justice and also systems change over time. So then, I wanted to start with this picture. So I think place is so important for us. It's where we live, it's where we work, it's how we shape our lives over time. It's really critical. This is actually my street. I've lived most of my life here, a place in Leighton in East London. So it's evolved so much over time. I've seen so much different changes, and it's impacted me and my society, especially when we think about living crisis, COVID, energy crisis in general. Everyone here has a home like that they care very deeply about when there's hard times and good times. Funny enough, not this exact shop, but one of the shops down there, one of my old school friends owned. And I asked him a question. I asked him a question around, do you own this shop? You've been here all this time. And he said, no, I own the whole street. It took me a while to understand what that meant. He didn't honestly own the whole street. But everyone in the community was connected with each other. When things were hard, when things were difficult, they bonded together. And that was really critical. And I lived in a very diverse part of London, very similar to Berlin right now, very multicultural. I'd always say one of the pleasures was I was able to walk down the road and hear multiple different languages. And that helped shape me. It was one of my privileges, the fact that I can speak to anyone who looks slightly different to me, but I felt a level of connection because we're all part of the same community, which was really critical. Growing up, it was a pleasure of watching shows like Dragon Ball Z to ZTV, which is a Bollywood channel, if anyone knows. Listen to music like Meatloaf to Mariah Carey, and also the ability to have food like jollof rice and jacket potatoes. That whole mixture growing up was really powerful and really important to me. And it goes to that side of things where I think about local communities as a network and how we can evolve and support them in general. I think as service designers, as people that want to create change over time, we all have a purpose, a why behind what we want to do. This is one of my whys. This was my mum. She was someone that actually shaped my career in terms of who I wanted to be, how do I wanted to be in the world in general. She helped me to problem solve. She helped me to think different, to collaborate, to show empathy. A lot of the skills we use as service designers today. I'm third generation British. I'm from multiple mixed heritages in general. But I still find that there's a concern in the underrepresented communities and how they can have access to the right funding for support. And I love the journey that I've gone through. Everything I do is for her. Everything I do is to make sure that other people do not have to face the same issues. She was a founder. She was a community member. She wanted to help her own space. Sadly, she wasn't able to achieve all of that. But with some of the work we've done with Power to Change, we're actually making sure that the right community members, underrepresented communities as well, can have access to those funds so they can make a difference in terms of where they are. Going back to my current career, I'm almost 35 now, working as a server designer, and I'll be lucky if I spend another 35 years doing the things I love, helping some of these amazing organizations innovate, change the way they think about services, businesses, and the such as well. But over the last 10 or 12 years, you'll be surprised it gets a little bit boring helping these large organizations make more money or improve efficiency. It's still something I mainly get to do in general, but I've got my own portfolio career now. I spend probably about 78% of my time still working with these large organizations, but the other 20 to 30% I get to give back. I get to help small businesses from underrepresented backgrounds. So if you're a female founder, first generation, maybe you haven't gone to university, for example, or you haven't gone for education, how do we ensure that they have the tools, skills, so they can make a difference in their lives, so we can have more people that can create their own futures, which is critical. So going to the talk today. So originally I was going to talk about the work we've done with Power to Change and Climate Labs. So Climate Labs is an agency that really focuses on how do we design a future around sustainability. Some amazing work. We were able to really think about how do we design a program that supports community leaders from minoritized backgrounds to really start thinking differently so they can have access to funds for climate action and change. This was critical. This happened last year. It was very complex, and I can go through all the details, and that's some of the things I'm going to talk about today. But I'm also going to focus on some of the lessons that we learned. I think most people are familiar with this image here. Hands up if you've seen something like this before. Perfect. It's a service blueprint. It usually has a start and end. It talks about the complexities in terms of what a customer sees, the front and the back end elements. But it doesn't tell the full picture. It's usually a beautiful artifact that says, oh, this is the final outcome. This is how we're going to design a future. And this is one of the artifacts and deliverables we created when we were helping define and discover what a better funding model would look like for those marginalized communities. It helped us really make sense of the complexity people have to go through when they're trying to access that funding, all the way from the awareness to going onto the program, all the way to accessing the funding and making sure that the funding was spent in the right way. But I don't really want to talk about it. I want to talk about the challenges that are in between this, that go beyond just the beautiful pictures in itself. And the question that I always like to ask as a designer is, are we measuring the right type of things? We can create multiple fantastic design artifacts like this, but what's the real meaning behind it? What's the sustainable long-term change we're creating for communities, organizations, and stakeholders as such? Also, if you've got access to the Service Design Network page, you can access it for free. So, shameless plug. But I'm going to go through some of the learnings that myself and the team at Climate Labs really learned, and hopefully that'll empower you to start thinking differently. A lot of these things are themed around this whole conference. The first one is really around how do we empower local communities from both the place and the design they're trying to develop, making sure they do the right thing over time. So what if we ensure that we empower local communities and entrepreneurs to design the right things for their place, their local communities in general, thinking very micro. The biggest challenge that I face, and I still face this all the time, is this whole design savior complex. We come in as designers, we have all these fancy tools. Probably the crowd here are very smart. They've either done PhDs or masters, or they've spent a certain amount of time developing their strategic design skills. And we think we can go into organizations, we can go into places, and we can change everything. It's almost a level of colonialism. We're going in and we think we're the best as designers. But we also need to take a step back. I've also been lucky enough to work around the world, Singapore, Mexico, UAE in general, and I always have to check myself sometimes because service design is very Western as an approach. I need to start listening and learning about what do they see, what do they understand, and ensure that they're really at the center of what we're trying to design in general, making sure we're creating it for the right place, right context, ensuring that we understand power structures in general, which is really key. The problem is, as designers, we don't always intend to, but we're designing for rather than with. How we're involving community, participants, clients throughout the whole process to be involved, that's sometimes quite critical and something we really miss out on. So it's getting that outside-in approach of what we're trying to design and making sense of that. And quite a few people have talked about this whole me versus we concept during the last 2 days, where we sometimes have this ego-focused approach. We're coming in, we know everything, we've worked on a similar project in the past, and we want to design something that fits our narrative. And we want to shift away from that. We want to think about the whole ecosystem, including community, including climate change. How does that build a better narrative over time? And that's where we started improving the way we thought about our program for Power to Change. From day one, we wanted to involve the right type of community members as a panel of experts, ensuring that they had a voice in whatever we were designing, whatever discussions were being had, making sure that was really clear from day one. But it was difficult to get some of these people on board. As you can imagine, if a stranger comes up to you and says, we're going to change your community for the better, or we're going to empower you to do something differently, a lot of these individuals are busy. They're doing their community work for free. And they're very skeptical. So there was an element of storytelling and listening to understand what they wanted out of this, to ensure that we made a commitment to every person, not just on this page, but everyone that would be impacted directly and indirectly. What were their voices? How could we ensure that they can own this after Climate Labs finished with their design work? Because a lot of designers, and I've done this before, we have 6 months, a year, sometimes less. We design something that's perfect and polished, then we just give it to the client or the community. And what usually happens is they look at it and they say, that's fantastic. Then they go back to normal. But by empowering them, by understanding what they need and designing with them, you're creating something that's more long-term. Change just doesn't happen in a year, 6 months. It can take 10 years. It can take many decades. We have to understand that. We have to humble ourselves. We have to realize that we were not the design saviors. It was quite critical. We also had to make sure that we paid and remunerated some of these individuals as well, because they spent a lot of time with us having conversations, making sure that we were building the right types of things. And we saw them as experts, and we wanted to pay them for their time. And there's this huge disparity around inequality when you think about marginalized communities as well. Making sure that you value their time is always critical. So that was one part. One thing I always love to reflect on, and some of you may have seen this before, there's something called the privilege wheel. Maybe some of you have seen this before, but it's a great way to make you rethink our privileges. I'll talk through this a little bit more, but in the center there means you've got the most privilege, and as you go out, you have less privilege. So for example, if you think about body size, are you slim, average, or large? If you're a larger person, society may not be designed for you. What about your career? Are you late in your career? Do you have lots of experience, lots of power? Or are you just starting out? One of the ones that are really quite critical is your citizenship. Are you a citizen? Are you documented? Are you undocumented? That can rapidly change your life in general. I always thought that I was underprivileged, being a person of color, coming from a working class background, single mum, so on and so on and so on. I thought I was basically the one that was underprivileged. But then I looked into this and I realized that I've got no physical disabilities. I'm quite well educated. I'm lucky enough to own my own home. I'm an English citizen. I want you to take about 30 seconds just to have a look at this. You don't need to discuss anything, but just reflect on some of these elements. What are some of your privileges? Some of the things that you don't understand that you're grateful for. The fact that most people are here today, I think that's a privilege itself. You get to be around all these amazing speakers and participants. We had to consider this privilege, Will, when we were trying to understand how do we design for the people that are the most vulnerable. So if you serve the most vulnerable people in those communities, 9% of the rest of the users will have access to funding. So we worked on that whole principle of who are the people that were on the margins, who are the people that needed the money the most, and then build on top of that over time. So then, I'm going to move on to the second lesson. And this is really making sure that, imagine if you could design a solution, a new solution, with a community in mind, making sure that they're the heart of what you're designing, especially when you're tackling complex issues. And as I said before, we were trying to juggle so many different things: climate action, marginalised communities, equality, social justice, a whole bunch of different things. And if anyone's worked on a project before where you start a project and think, oh, we can tackle this, it's fine, we've scoped it out, we've got enough resources, there's a budget here. But then, as always, the more you immerse yourself, it starts becoming like this. You're this little turtle as a designer, and you have to go across this huge maze of unknowns and complexity. That's the biggest challenge that we faced when we're looking at trying to solve this issue in general. It was making sense of what could we solve, what will need to be passed off, and how do we empower the community in general, which was really critical. It was making sure that we can align with Power to Change to ensure that they knew what they were getting at the end, but also ensuring that we can ensure that this project can help them in the future. So not just the 9 months that we were working on the project, there was a legacy of work that they can take on with maybe a new design team or maybe a new partner. Another thing as well was the team, very dynamic. 4 different ethnicities. One of our colleagues, Rebecca, was actually from Mexico. So we all had different voices around what community meant from our businesses, how that would be framed, as well as having different experiences. People were builders, people were focusing on sustainability, server design. We're able to add a lens on what that looked like. And once again, we wanted to make sure that everyone had a voice when we're talking about how we can create real value, but also how that can be passed on as an area. We got to the stage where we took a step back and we thought we needed to actually change the brief slightly. This is a classic systems map. You've got areas around lack of representation, making sure there's a diverse message, ensuring that there's positive influence over time, ensuring there's community ownership. This goes past the normal brief of creating a new funding program for climate action. There were all these hidden elements that we'd had to discover at the beginning. This was through speaking to different stakeholders that were directly and indirectly impacted by what we're trying to design, but also making sure that we could see what the bigger picture was. So when we create something that's new as a funding program, how would it directly impact people on a positive and negative level? The third point, this is really how could we ensure that we focus on coming together to collectively define what success looked like. And this is a build on the last lesson. So everyone wants to be the hero of their own story. There's actually quite a few things that we really wanted to focus on. It was ensuring that we were listening to different community members. Here, we actually spent some time asking people to share what success looked like, them going back to their own communities and sharing experiences they've seen that have actually worked. This helped us really shape the future. This helped us make sense of diverse contexts, messages, and also the ability to share how we can create something new, not just from a designer's point of view, but from a community-led point of view. This was really critical. And this success helped us understand some of the micro steps that Power to Change had to consider when they were designing a new funding model. This helped us with our insights and also helping them think about the bigger picture. So rather than the work that we were doing, we realized that this work needed to live on beyond just climate labs as a design team. We created a number of fancy diagrams again, but with the community involved. So going past the whole idea of a simple service blueprint, we wanted to gather that insights from speaking to community, taking a step back and reimagining what success looked like, and how do we tackle complexity, and put that into steps, insights, and strategies for them to define what success looked like for the next 5 to 10 years. And that was really critical. These frameworks really helped us identify who they need to engage with in the future and make sure that they were continuously learning and they can actually build off some of the design skills that we had, but also leverage what they already knew. Because we're not the experts as designers, we're going back to the people that live and feel these pain points all the time. And this is actually after our work with Power to Change. They actually released a recent report which looked at their 5-year strategy to empower place and change for the next few years. So how do they shape the future? Climate Labs actually identified 3 key areas and it helped them build out their own framework. And once again, after COVID, as there's more issues such as the cost of living crisis getting worse and worse, changes in economies and local communities being sadly the last people that will get benefits or get funding, working with communities in workshops to define how do you shape that over time. And this is an ongoing journey. They may be working with another design team or maybe another 10 design teams in the future, but it's making sure that the work we do is a continuous process. So we're not coming in as designers and just reshaping everything that they've done before to say, oh, that design team, their work was rubbish. We want to say, yes, how can we build on that work, which is really critical. So I've covered 3 areas. I also want to make sure there's enough time for Q&A as well. Here's a 3. Now, what can you do in the audience? We can talk about a problem, we can do something, or both. So there's a couple of takeaways that I really want you to think about. So first of all, how can you really make sure that you can create long-lasting change? So how can you involve people across the whole system? Think about who the different stakeholders you can involve, from funders, from community members, to policymakers. How are they going to work over time in the design you're trying to create? How can you support local experts? These are people that are living day in and day out in these communities that really care about climate action, but also their local environment. A solution that might work for one area may not work for another. So always try to make sure that their voice is heard. And also, are you taking on too much? There's a thing as such as a project being too complex for you to come in as. You're not the savers, you can't solve everything. So try to break things down and make sure that you can actually deliver something at the end of it. It's not just a huge mess. And then how do we shift to a new way of thinking in general? So how do we think about getting participants, organizations, communities to be the center of the design they want to create? And finally, what have you changed your mind about? This is a little added one here. So every time I work on a new project, there's always a new thing I've changed my mind about. I've worked in design for over a decade now, and I'm still learning. I'm probably going to be learning for the next 35 years, if I'm lucky, as a designer in some way or some form. So that's it. If you want to contact us at Climate Labs, here's the information here. I've got some other information here as well, so have a look at me, contact me. And also, I just added this slide in, but I know there's a lot of QR codes out here, so here's one. You can download the slides. Thank you.